My wife accepted $100,000 to sleep with her boss. That's what Mary told me on a Tuesday night over burnt pasta, like she was discussing a business merger instead of selling our 8-year marriage. She said it was just 6 months, just until the money cleared, just until we could finally afford the life she'd always wanted. I walked out that night with nothing but a duffel bag and my father's voice in my head about integrity. 3 weeks later, her boss ghosted her without paying a dime. 2 weeks after that, she was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. What happened next will make you question everything you know about betrayal, karma, and whether some prices are too high even when you're desperate. Viewers, have you ever watched someone you love destroy themselves for money that never existed? What would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Before this story begins, subscribe. You'll never look at relationships the same way again. My name is Brian Mark. I'm a 34-year-old high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon. For the past 8 years, I've lived what I thought was a simple, honest life with my wife Mary in our modest 2-bedroom house near Laurelhurst Park. I drove a 2015 Honda Civic, graded papers on Sunday evenings, and believed that love, real love, was built on trust, not transactions. My father was a carpenter who died at 58 from a heart attack in our garage, and he taught me that a man's word was worth more than any paycheck. That integrity wasn't something you could mortgage. I held on to that belief like a lifeline, even when money got tight, even when Mary would stare at our bank statements with that hollow look in her eyes that reminded me of someone drowning in shallow water. She worked at Davidson and Reeves, a boutique marketing firm downtown, and she'd come home talking about Richard Davidson, the co-founder, with a strange mix of admiration and something else I couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Or hunger. I should have paid more attention to that look. I should have asked more questions about the late meetings, the weekend conferences, the way she'd started dressing differently, sharper, more expensive, clothes we definitely couldn't afford on our combined income. But I trusted her. I trusted us. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was believing that the life we'd built together, the Sunday morning pancakes, the Netflix binges, the inside jokes that nobody else would ever understand, was enough to keep her anchored when someone offered her a way out of the poverty that still haunted her dreams. Mary grew up watching her mother work 3 jobs after her father abandoned them. She was 9 when they lost their house. She slept in a car for 4 months, and she never talked about it except once, on our wedding night, when she'd had too much champagne and whispered against my chest that she'd rather die than ever be that powerless again. I held her tighter and promised her she'd never have to worry. I was wrong. Or maybe I was right, and that's exactly why everything fell apart. This is the story of how $100,000 bought my wife's betrayal, and how cancer became the cruelest plot twist neither of us saw coming. It started on a Tuesday night in late September, when Mary came home looking like she'd seen her own ghost. The kitchen smelled like garlic and burnt olive oil. I tried making pasta, one of the 3 dishes I could actually cook without setting off the smoke alarm, and Mary had barely touched hers. She sat across from me at our tiny wooden table, the one we'd bought at an estate sale in Selwood for $60, and her hands were trembling around her wine glass. I asked her 3 times what was wrong before she finally looked up at me with eyes I didn't recognize. They were darker somehow, like someone had drained something essential out of them. She said she needed to tell me something, and I had to let her finish before I reacted. My fork stopped midair. The wedding photo on the wall behind her, us laughing in Forest Park, sunlight caught in her hair like she was some kind of angel, suddenly felt like evidence from another lifetime. She told me her boss, Richard Davidson, the 52-year-old co-founder of the firm, had made her an offer. A business arrangement, she called it. He would pay her $100,000, cash, untraceable, if she agreed to be his companion. His words, not hers. Weekend trips to the coast. Dinner meetings that ran late into downtown Portland nights. Public appearances at galas where his wife wouldn't attend. She said it would only be for 6 months, just until the merger went through with the Seattle branch, and then we'd have enough money to finally buy that house we wanted in West Lynn, maybe start a family without worrying about my student loans or her credit card debt that she thought I didn't know about, but I'd seen the statements hidden in her underwear drawer. I stared at her. Asked if she was actually telling me her boss offered her $100,000 to sleep with him, and she was considering it. She looked down at her half-eaten pasta, at the cheap wine we bought from Trader Joe's, at everything we'd built together that suddenly wasn't enough. She said she'd already said yes. That she was starting this weekend. I remember the exact sound of my chair scraping against the linoleum when I stood up. How the kitchen light flickered, it had been doing that for weeks and I kept meaning to fix it, and cast these strange shadows across her face that made her look like a stranger wearing my wife's skin. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just walked to our bedroom and started packing a duffel bag. Mary followed me down the hallway, suddenly frantic, her voice pitching higher than I'd ever heard it. She asked what I was doing, told me to wait, said we should talk about this like adults. I told her adults don't sell their marriages while I shoved t-shirts and jeans into my gym bag, not even caring that nothing matched or that I was probably forgetting my toothbrush. She said it wasn't like that it was just business, that people did this all the time in high-level corporate situations and I wouldn't understand because I'd never had to fight for anything in my life. That last part hit me like a slap. I told her I was a teacher making $52,000 a year, that I lived in the real world, and in the real world what she just described was called prostitution. She actually slapped me then. Hard. The sound echoed in our small bedroom with its unmade bed and her makeup scattered across the dresser. She told me not to dare judge her, that I had no idea what it was like to grow up with nothing, to be afraid every single day that it could all disappear. That Richard was offering us a future. I zipped up my bag and told her he was offering her a price tag, and she took it. I left that night and stayed at my buddy Aaron's apartment across town, a cramped studio that smelled like old pizza and existential regret. Aaron didn't ask questions when I showed up at midnight with wild eyes and shaking hands. He just handed me a beer and pulled out the couch bed that squeaked every time I shifted positions. I lay there staring at water stains on his ceiling, thinking about my father. How he'd worked with his hands his whole life, building cabinets and bookshelves and decks for people who could afford to pay him but never quite enough. How he taught me that integrity wasn't negotiable, that some things couldn't be bought or sold without losing something fundamental in the transaction. Walking out on Mary felt like honoring him. Staying would have been spitting on his grave. I filed for separation the next morning. But I couldn't let it go. I know I should have. I signed the papers at Jennifer Park's law office, a cramped space above a Vietnamese restaurant on Hawthorne, and told myself I was done, that Mary had made her choice and I needed to make mine. Except I kept thinking about Richard Davidson's face in those firm photos Mary used to show me, the ones where he looked distinguished and successful and exactly like the kind of man who thought people could be purchased. 2 weeks after I left, I found myself parked outside the Heathman Hotel downtown on a Saturday night at 7:30, rain streaking my windshield, feeling like the worst kind of pathetic. I saw Mary arrive at 7:43. She wore the black dress I'd bought her for our 5th anniversary, the one that cost $200 I couldn't really afford but bought anyway because she'd looked at it in that boutique window like it represented everything she wanted to become. She looked beautiful. She looked like a stranger. Richard met her at the entrance in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He kissed her cheek and she didn't pull away, just smiled this small, tight smile I'd never seen before. They disappeared inside and I sat there for 3 hours, watching the lit window on the 9th floor, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white and Aaron kept texting asking if I was okay and I kept not answering because I didn't know how to explain that I was watching my marriage end in real time through hotel glass. At 11:07, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message said stop watching, that I was embarrassing myself, that she made her choice, signed RD. I looked up at the 9th floor window. The curtains were open. Richard Davidson was standing there looking down at my car, phone in hand, and Mary was right beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and I swear to God she was looking right at me. Jennifer Park's office smelled like stale coffee and desperation. She was expensive, $300 an hour, but Aaron had helped me scrape together the retainer by lending me $2,000 he definitely couldn't afford to lend. During our 3rd meeting, she leaned back in her chair, made it squeak in that way that suggested she'd heard 1,000 terrible stories in that exact position, and told me she'd been digging into Richard Davidson's background. She slid a folder across her cluttered desk and I opened it with hands that had started shaking again, a nervous habit I'd developed since leaving Mary. Inside were court documents, sealed settlements from 2018 and 2021, 2 other women who'd worked for Davidson and Reeves, both married, both received large cash payments, both signed non-disclosure agreements that kept them silent. Jennifer said Richard had a pattern. He targeted married women in financial distress, offered them money, used them until he got bored or the arrangement became inconvenient, then discarded them like used tissues. The NDAs ensured they'd never talk because going public would destroy their marriages anyway, and most of them had already lost everything else. I asked why married women specifically, why not just hire escorts or find willing single women in a city full of them? Jennifer tapped the folder with one manicured fingernail and said one word, control. Married women had more to lose, were easier to manipulate, less likely to make demands or catch feelings or threaten his reputation. It was efficient, she said, in the same tone you might use to describe a well-designed machine. She'd found something else too. Richard's own divorce records from 2016, his ex-wife Patricia accusing him of coercive sexual misconduct with employees. The case settled out of court for $1.2 million. Patricia moved to Vancouver and never spoke publicly about it, signed her own NDA, and Richard kept his business and his reputation and his predatory hobbies. I felt sick. Not just because of what he'd done to those other women, but because Mary had walked into this knowing, or maybe not knowing, maybe that was worse, that she was just another transaction in a long line of transactions. It was 2:17 in the morning when my phone rang and I saw Mary's sister Rebecca's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I was in Aaron's apartment, couldn't sleep again, had been reading about narcissistic personality disorder on my phone for 3 hours. Like that would somehow help me understand what had happened to my life. Rebecca's voice was shaking when she said please don't hang up, that she knew I hated Mary right now but she needed to tell me something. I said I couldn't do this, couldn't hear excuses or explanations or whatever message Mary had sent her baby sister to deliver. Rebecca said Mary was sick. Just those 3 words in the dark silence of Aaron's studio apartment with traffic sounds filtering up from Burnside Street. I asked what she meant and Rebecca told me Mary had gone to the doctor last week, been having symptoms for months, bleeding and pain she'd been hiding, thought it was stress from the separation. They did a biopsy. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, aggressive, the kind that kills you if you don't catch it early and sometimes even when you do. The room spun. I sat down on Aaron's lumpy couch and tried to process what I was hearing. Rebecca said Mary didn't know she was calling me, had made her promise not to, but Mary was terrified and alone because Richard Davidson had dropped her the second she told him about the diagnosis. Said he couldn't deal with this right now, stopped returning her calls, blocked her number. Then Rebecca said something that made my blood run cold. He never gave her the money. Mary had done everything he asked for 6 weeks, the hotels, the dinners, the weekend trip to Cannon Beach where she told me she was at a work conference, and he ghosted her. No check. No wire transfer, nothing. She'd sold our marriage for a promise that evaporated the moment she became inconvenient. I don't know why I went to the hospital. Maybe guilt, maybe morbid curiosity, maybe some pathetic part of me still loved the woman she used to be before Richard Davidson and $100,000 propositions and cancer. Providence Portland Medical Center, 4th floor, room 412. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and fear. Mary looked small in that hospital bed, smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her hair already thinner though the nurse said that was stress, not chemo yet, that would start next week. She saw me standing in the doorway and started crying immediately, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. She said she was sorry, kept saying it like a mantra, like if she said it enough times it might actually mean something. I sat in the chair across from her bed, didn't move closer, kept the 4 stand between us like a barrier. I asked her why she did it, and told her not to give me the poverty speech again because we'd had options. We could have worked more, saved more, talked about our problems like people who actually loved each other. She wiped her eyes and told me something I wasn't expecting. Said Richard made her feel valuable, that I loved her but never needed her, and he made her feel like she was worth something beyond grading papers and Sunday morning pancakes. I told her she was worth everything until she put a price on herself. Then she whispered something I barely heard, something that changed everything again. She said this wasn't the first time. 2 years ago at the company retreat in Bend, she'd slept with someone from the Seattle office, some guy whose name she claimed not to remember. Said it didn't mean anything, just a mistake, too much wine and not enough sense. But when Richard made his offer, it felt like the universe was telling her that's all she was good for anyway, being wanted, even if she had to be bought. I called Richard Davidson 3 days later and told him I wanted to meet. He suggested Canard, a French place downtown where a salad costs $40 and the waiters look at you with contempt if you pronounce anything wrong. He showed up 20 minutes late, reeking of expensive cologne and entitlement, his suit probably worth more than my car. He sat down across from me and said he was surprised I called, figured I'd be licking my wounds somewhere, maybe drunk in a dive bar or crying to my teacher friends about my failed marriage. I told him he didn't pay Mary. He sipped his wine, ordered without asking if I wanted anything, and said business fell through, the Seattle merger collapsed, he didn't pay for unfinished services. I told him she was dying. He said he heard, unfortunate, bad timing really, these things happen. I wanted to lunge across the table and break his nose against the white tablecloth. Instead I pulled out my phone and placed it between us. Told him about Jennifer Park, my attorney, about 3 former employees ready to talk, willing to break their NDAs if he didn't make this right. His expression didn't change but his jaw tightened, this tiny muscle near his ear starting to pulse. He said I was bluffing. I told him to try me because unlike him I had nothing left to lose, and Oregon was a one-party consent state, which meant every conversation I'd recorded with Mary about his arrangement, every text message, every sordid detail, was completely admissible in court. I'd been documenting everything since the separation, not because I planned this confrontation but because some part of me knew I'd need evidence that I wasn't crazy, that this had actually happened. He stared at me for a long moment, then signaled for the check. 3 days later, $100,000 appeared in Mary's account. I met Mary at a coffee shop near the hospital, one of those places with exposed brick and overpriced lattes where everyone pretends to write screenplays on their MacBooks. She looked better than she had in the hospital room. Steroids from the treatment had brought some color back to her face, though her hands still shook when she slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check made out to me for $50,000. She said she couldn't take my money, not after everything she'd done, everything she'd destroyed. I pushed it back across the scarred wooden table and told her it wasn't my money, it was blood money, and I didn't want a single dollar of it touching my life. She asked what she should do with it then, her voice small and broken. I stood up, grabbed my coat, told her to pay for her treatment, pay off her debts, donate it to charity for all I cared, but don't insult me by pretending this fixed anything. She started crying again, she was always crying now, and asked if I thought I'd ever forgive her. I looked at her sitting there in that coffee shop, this woman I'd promised to love forever, who'd promised the same to me, and I realized I didn't know her anymore. Maybe I never had. Maybe she'd been drowning in fear and resentment our entire marriage and I'd been too busy grading papers and believing in integrity to notice. I told her I didn't know if I'd ever forgive her, but I knew I wasn't the same person who loved her, and she wasn't the woman I married, and maybe that was the real tragedy. As I walked toward the door, she called after me, said there was something else I needed to know about Richard Davidson, something that would change how I saw everything. I stopped at the door, hand on the handle, rain visible through the glass. Mary walked toward me with her arms wrapped around herself against the October cold that was seeping through the poorly insulated coffee shop. She told me Richard had cancer too. Pancreatic, stage 4, he'd had it for 8 months, since before he'd even approached her with his offer. That's why he was doing this, the affairs, the control, the desperate need to own people, because he was dying and wanted to feel powerful one last time before the end. She said he told her the night she revealed her own diagnosis, actually laughed about it, said they were cosmically linked like it was poetic or romantic instead of just cruel. I felt numb standing there, rain starting to come down harder outside. Mary said she wasn't telling me this for sympathy, that she didn't deserve sympathy, but she needed me to understand that evil doesn't always look like a monster in a slasher film. Sometimes it looks like a successful businessman in a nice suit who's terrified of dying alone. And sometimes it looks like a woman so afraid of being poor again that she'd sell her soul for security that was never real to begin with. Richard Davidson died 4 months later, right before Christmas. His obituary in the Oregonian called him a visionary entrepreneur and devoted philanthropist. It didn't mention the women he destroyed. It never does. Mary's in remission now, I heard it through Rebecca, who still texts me sometimes with updates I never ask for but read anyway. Mary moved back in with her mom in Eugene, started therapy, sold the house we bought together. I'm still teaching at the same high school, still in Portland, started seeing someone new named Amy who's a librarian at Powell's Books. She's kind and uncomplicated and doesn't know this story yet. Maybe I'll never tell her. Sometimes late at night I think about what Mary said in that coffee shop, about fear making us do unforgivable things, about how we're all just one bad decision away from becoming people we don't recognize. I don't forgive her. I don't think I ever will. But I understand her a little better now, and maybe that's all any of us can hope for, not redemption, but understanding, not closure but the wisdom to recognize our own capacity for betrayal before it's too late. If this shocked you, subscribe, like, comment and share. Because the next story is worse.